This is the 2023 Nissan Z, and today I brought its arch rival, the Toyota Supra. We're going to talk about the price, we're going to talk about the features and specs, and then we're going to take them for a drive and see how they compare. So first off, you should know this is an all-Japanese sports car. This is made in Japan on the same assembly line as the 370Z. And this car here has caused a little bit of controversy because this is not exactly fully Japanese. This is actually made in Graz, Austria. And it's full of BMW stuff. It's got a BMW engine, it has BMW suspension. Basically everything in here is BMW except for the body. And that causes a lot of controversy. So let's talk about price. There are basically two core specs for the Z. There's the Sport and the Performance, which this is. So this is $10 less than $50,000. I'm just gonna call it $50,000. And then there's the Sport, and that is $10 less than $40,000. So we've got a big price difference between the two levels, and also there's a big price difference between this Supra. Now the Supra is priced quite a bit higher. For $44,000 you get the 2-liter, which is a 4-cylinder engine. That's already more than the base of the Z, and this is the premium, and in 2022 dollars, this is about $55,000. So you can get in to the Z a whole lot cheaper than you can the Supra, and that is the #1 difference that I think is really significant. There's also a third trim level, which you won't be able to get because they're only making 240 of them. Get that? It is the Proto spec, and that is about $53,000, and it is yellow and it has yellow stitching. Good luck if you can get one. You get the same engine in the Sport and the Performance, and that's a 3-liter engine. It's the VR30 DDTT. It's a twin turbo, it's a V6, and it makes 400 horsepower and 350 pound-feet of torque. This engine has been around since about 2015, and you're gonna find this in the Infiniti Q50 and the Q60, making various levels of power. And this engine is essentially a carryover from those cars. I think the specs are pretty good. Let's talk about this. We're gonna go over to Germany here, and this is a B58 engine, and it makes a little bit less power than the Z does. This makes 382 horsepower and about 368 pound-feet of torque. The torque comes on a little bit later also. You get maximum torque from 1800 RPM, and in the Z, it comes up from 1600 RPM. And one of the big differences between the Supra and the Z is that this comes with a manual transmission standard, and you can't even get it in the Supra yet. It's gonna be out in 2023, but I think Toyota was kind of responding to what Nissan is doing here. So you can get either the 6-speed manual transmission or a 9-speed automatic, and there's no difference in price. The brakes are bigger on the Z than the Supra. This has 14-inch rotors up front with 4-piston Akebono brakes. In the rear, we have 13.8 rotors, and this on the Performance Edition. On the Sport, you get brakes that are a little bit smaller. And on the Supra, we have 13.7-inch rotors up front. These are 4-piston Brembos, and they're a little bit smaller in the back, so a little bit less brake here. Let's talk about the suspension setup. So this does have active dampers, and this is a McPherson-type strut setup up front. And over here, we have a double wishbone suspension, which is sort of more of a race car type setup, I guess you could say. Monotube shocks, and the valving is a little bit different than the 370Z. In the rear of both of the cars, we have a multi-link suspension. Both of these cars have limited slip differentials. Now, you do need to get the Performance Edition to get the limited slip here. This is a clutch type style, and Nissan sort of internally refers it to as a 1.5 way. So you're not going to lock up suddenly. It's going to be very progressive and going to apply power progressively when you need it. In the Supra, we've got something pretty similar. Let's talk about styling. And of course, this is super subjective, but I think this is a very good looking car. I think this is very successful. They have something called the Katana sword over here. And we do have the Z lettering, which is the original Z lettering from 1969 on the 240Z. And this car has a lot of design cues. They're talking about a lot of heritage in this car, and you can see all of the heritage here. For example, in the taillights, this is really representative of the 300ZX, and you have this sort of really smooth look over here, and these really pop out in a really sort of crisp and clean way. One of the things you do get on this Performance Edition is you do get this little spoiler over here, this little lip. That's different from the Sport. Let's talk about the rest of the car here. So just the whole profile of the car really reminds me of previous Zs. You see a real sort of history lesson going on here between this and the previous Zs, and I think overall it's a pretty successful looking vehicle. Another thing you got here, which goes back to the history, is these vertical door handles as well. So up front here, we have a little bit more from the past, although this square cutout here, this is definitely something that's a little bit more modern, I think. We have these sort of rounded type shapes in here too. Probably my least favorite part of the car. But we've got these headlights also, which harken back again to the original 240Z, which were round in that car. And here they're sort of elongated and they're sort of shaped into the fender. Not my favorite part of the car, but again, looks are pretty subjective. I do like the hood. We sort of have this power bulge here, this sort of Y shape, which sort of culminates right over here in this 3 points coming down to the Nissan logo. I think overall, this is a very good looking car. I think they've done a great job with it. And I think a lot of people really like it too. And I've been sort of warming up to it. When I first saw the Proto Z, I wasn't that crazy about it, but I kind of dig it right now. So Toyota has a little bit of history in here, but they're not doing as much of a history lesson as the Z. We have these headlights, which are sort of representative of the Mark IV Supra, but the whole nose is quite modern and quite different, and it's not quite as sort of upright looking as the Z. And this is maybe one of the more controversial parts about the car. We've got this huge clamshell hood, and the car is much more sort of a flowing kind of, I think it just flows a little bit more. It's a little bit less boxy looking, and it has more round curves. One of the big things that I notice is the fender bulges in the back are quite noticeable here too. But again, styling is super subjective. And then going over to the taillights, we have these very thin sort of razor style taillights, and there's just a lot of curves going on here. There's not so many angles. It's definitely a more softer look kind of car. And really, like I say, styling is subjective. So I'm gonna kind of leave that up to you guys. Let me know in the comments which one you think looks better, especially considering the price point. Let's talk about the interior here. So there's a lot of BMW going on in the interior, especially the center stack, which you've got the heating and ventilation controls, which is pure BMW, and is the steering wheel. And they're both fairly small cockpit style cabins, I guess you could say. You really have a feeling that you're kind of closed in and you're in a little fighter jet, I guess. I think the Supra feels a little bit more cramped inside. This is my personal impression. I think the door, tops of the door is a little bit higher. It feels like there's a little bit less space. And the impression of quality, I think, is pretty good in both of them. Neither of them are super fancy or super expensive feeling. You've definitely got a smaller screen in the Supra. And overall, I think, you know, it's probably a little bit of a wash. It's sort of gonna depend on your taste. I think for the money, let's talk about the Z. So over in the Z here, everything from this side up is brand new compared to the 370Z, and they've done a really nice job with the materials in here. We have some suede in here. We have a little bit of stitched leather. We have fairly soft touch door panels in the top, and the seats are quite comfortable. They are also suede centers here with leather on the side. We have stitching, and these come in a couple of different colors depending on the car that you get. You can get this in red, blue, and black. Also in the center, we have what is a 9-inch display here. This is optional. And of course, we have 3 dials in the middle, and we have the gauges up top, which I'll talk about in just a second. And hallelujah, a manual transmission. The driver information display is really great. It's big, it's bright. This is a TFT display, and it's super configurable. I'll show you that in a second. And then in the center, we have these 3 gauges up here, which of course reminds me of the 370Z. And it's kind of old school what you're getting here too. You've got volts. On the left, you've got boost, which is pretty cool. In the middle, you've got turbo speed, and apparently it goes up to about 250,000 RPM. So kind of a fun little bling. I think it's just sort of fun for a sports car enthusiast just to see something like that. So display is really configurable. This is the sport display. There's 3 different ones. So this is the one I think most people are going to use. You've got the tach front and center. You've got the engine oil temperature and the water temperature there. And you can change it with this button right over here. You can go to normal. So this is the normal display. You've got your tach on the left, you've got your speedo on the right, and in the center, you can change things that you're gonna be looking at while you're driving, such as your navigation, your tire pressure, drive computer, all that kind of stuff. And then finally, there is another display called Enhanced. And it looks like this basically, and again, you've got your tach way on the left, you've got your speedo way on the right, and you can have different things in the center. So you basically have a larger center display. So on paper, these cars are actually incredibly similar. So let's take them for a drive and see what we think. All right, let's see what she got. 400 horsepower manual. Oh, oh, Wow. It sounds really good, and I like the transmission. It's very easy to shift, and it does rev matching too. So if I want to downshift, perfect downshifts. Let me go down one more gear. Perfect downshift. Good power. Yeah, this is very, very entertaining to drive, and I like the fact that this has a manual transmission. It's a good manual transmission, and if you're familiar with the 370Z, this is a very familiar driving experience. It's just a little bit extra. It's a little bit more. So let's talk about the chassis. I think the chassis is pretty firm in this. They've definitely done some stiffening in this. This is, I'm not quite sure what the percentage is stiffer than the 370Z, but it's noticeable. And also, the transmission is really good. The engine, the engine is so good. That 400 horsepower hits really quickly. There's almost no turbo lag at all. You've got all the torque from 1600 RPM, and you can really feel it. So this is, like I say, a fairly stiff car. I'd say the Supra is perhaps just a hair stiffer, but the overall driving impression of this is really, really good. Nissan has done a fantastic job with this, especially at the $40,000 price point, especially for the Sport. That is tremendous value. I think this is a great car. It feels really good. The inputs are really nice. The brakes feel good. The steering feels nicely weighted too, and I like the sound that this thing makes. And this is going to be good for a road trip. You don't have a little bit of the boominess that used to give the 370Z, a little bit of that slightly tin can kind of aspect. That's gone here. This feels like a really solid vehicle. This is something that I would definitely consider buying if you're an enthusiast. Now, unfortunately, we're not at the track today, so I can't really evaluate the handling as much as I would like to. But this does seem to go around corners pretty well for the couple of times that I've been able to take it around a corner. And I just like the way that this thing is put together. I really like the center display. This gives you a lot of information. It's highly configurable. This is way better than the Supra in terms of the information that you're getting here. And I like this 9-inch display here too. But just the way it drives is really good. And that rev matching is really good too. It's pretty easy to turn on and off. And another nice thing, if you do want to shift it yourself, I'm just going to turn off this rev matching button over here. And on the dashboard, the little S goes away. And if you want to heel and tow it yourself, the pedal placement is perfect. So if you're a track gearhead like myself and you want to go to the track, you want to heel and tow, you want to do it all yourself, pedal placement is really, really good. And these big brakes are going to stop you really, really effectively too. So I like the layout of the cabin. Everything falls nicely to hand. The transmission's in the right place. The steering wheel feels good. It's very easy to get comfortable in here. This has got the power seats, but frankly, you don't need them. I think you're going to be fine with the Sport buckets. They're the same basic layout. You just don't get the nice material that you get with here. And so let me show you a little bit of manual rev matching, which I think I'll be able to do pretty well here. All right. Not quite perfect, but here we'll come up to a stoplight and do a little downshift. There we go, perfect. So it's easy to heel and tow, if that matters to anybody anymore, but I love heeling and towing. So this is great. Let's do a quick drive in the Supra. So I'm in the Supra, and there's a couple things that I've done to try to equalize the two cars. So this is not a 2022 Supra. That wasn't available to me in time. I have 2 hours to make this video. So this is a 2020, and this has been tuned to make 382 horsepower, which is the same as the 2022 has. But now let's hit it and see what the engine is like. Okay, so this is pretty quick, and this does have an aftermarket exhaust, and I think the sound is pretty good in here, and I think it's also pretty good in the Z as well. This engine is, the power to weight ratio is very, very similar between the two cars, and it's not really fair to compare the automatic transmission, which this has, to the 6-speed manual in the Z. I feel like this is perhaps a hair quicker, but again, for $40,000 that we're talking about, you know, it's pretty close. And again, I'm just going with my butt dyno right now. I'm not really sure that it's quicker or not. So ride quality, I think, is really, really close between these two vehicles here. I do have aftermarket springs on this, so it makes it a little bit stiffer. But overall, my impression of the ride quality is actually quite similar. Handling is is probably going to be pretty much a wash at this point. That does have double wishbone suspension, multi-link in the rear, and yes, this has adaptive dampers, and that doesn't. It's sort of difficult to really compare them back to back on city streets like this and just taking a little quick drive. So I'm going to have to leave that for another day, but they do feel pretty equivalent, and the braking feels really good in both of these vehicles too. I think the main difference I'm really going to point out is that this feels just a little bit stiffer in terms of structure, but I'm going to come back to the point of $40,000 entry point versus $55,000 entry point for this, or $52,000 if you want to go with the lesser equipped Supra, so maybe that's a better comparison. We're still talking about $12,000 difference, and is this $12,000 better than the Z? That's a pretty hard argument to make. The Z, I would say, is 90% of this at a much lower price point. Now, when you get to the $50,000 Performance Edition versus this, yeah, the argument isn't quite as good. The Z really fills a slot between the less expensive cars, the lower powered cars down there with the Miata and the GR86 and the BRZ, and more expensive cars like the Corvette. A lot of people just don't like the fact that this is essentially a BMW, and the Nissan Z just feels a little bit more like a classic Japanese car. I'm just going to come out and say it. It just feels a little bit more Japanese than this does, and it's very good. Perhaps the level of refinement isn't quite as high, but man, it's close. It's a really good value, and let's talk about my thoughts. So, which car should you go with? At $55,000, this is a fairly expensive car for the premium, and we know if you're going to spend $44,000, you're going to get the 2-liter engine. It's not such a great deal. Now over here, even though this is the premium, you can get the Sport for $40,000, and you get the same 400 horsepower engine, you get the same 6-speed manual transmission or 9-speed automatic, depending on what you like. This is an incredible value, and this drives really, really well. It's fast, it handles well, the transmission is great, all the controls fall nicely to hand. It's enjoyable to drive. This is a tremendous value. And if you look at things like the GR86 and the BRZ, which are about $30,000, for a $10,000 upcharge, you get something that is way more powerful and way more of a real sports car. So I'll leave it to you. Let me know which one you think is better. I've got another video up on screen right now talking about how you can tune this car.